Okay, so I don't know if I'm going to post this video or not. It's not a huge deal either way, but I need to talk about things. And, if you leave things, this is why I think it's important to be open and transparent. And to be open and transparent on a regular basis, because then it's just sort of like, it's like a stream, or like a stream versus like a pond. A stream, the water is constantly flowing, whether it's thoughts, ideas, or whatever. And a pond, the water's stagnant. With a stream, you think of all these fish and they're swimming in the stream. In a pond, you think of like algae and like different things growing and stuff like that. And I think a stream's healthier than a pond. With a stream, the water's constantly circulating. With a pond, the water's stagnant and like things can grow in it, sometimes unhealthy bacteria. I like to think about your thoughts like that as well. A stream is like the healthy flow of your thoughts, whereas a pond is like if you have any like suppressed thoughts that you aren't letting out. And there's something that I've been talking about there's something I haven't been talking about. And I'm worried that if I don't talk about it, it's just going to fester into like a pond and it's just going to it's not going to be the best. Whereas like a stream is going to be like, it's just going to be healthier. It's going to be healthier for me. And I don't have my setup right now. Typically I've been using my tripod, my little cell phone tripod, and been recording, whether outside or in my room. But since this was spontaneous, because I typically don't record at night just because I have to use a lamp versus sunlight, I haven't been recording at night, so I'm holding my phone, which is a little different this time. But I wanted to talk about what was on my mind, and typically I don't like talking about super personal topics, just because I want the things that I talk about on this channel to be applicable to other people. But this is going to be a little bit slightly personal, just because I need to vent about certain things. And I don't want it to become a pond. I want my thoughts to be like a stream. I want my emotional state to be like a stream where it's healthy and it's flowing and it's vibing, whereas with a pond, I don't want anything to fester, like anything to just stay on the bottom unresolved. I want things to constantly be flowing and to be resolved and continuous and I had a very difficult childhood. On the outside, it looked perfect. I went to a good school, I was in sports, I had a lot of after school activities, things like that. And I always had food to eat, things like that. On the outside, it looked like I had a really, really good life. But behind closed doors, there was a lot of abuse in my family, like physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and it was really bad. And a lot of it was a really, really toxic, unhealthy environment. I'm not going to talk about in the physical abuse or the sexual abuse. I'm just going to talk about the emotional abuse. Because the physical abuse, it's pretty straightforward. The sexual abuse is really personal. And then the toxic environment part is the part of it that I'm going to talk about. Because a lot of it is difficult to heal. The emotional abuse, I think, is much more difficult to heal. The physical abuse is it's much more easy to understand and to register. It's like fear of loud noises or like people like stomping by, because it just reminds me of when my parents would be angry and they would start throwing things or breaking things, or like they literally broke down a hole in my door before. And whenever my dad would be angry, he would like stomp really hard and I would run and hide. So like loud noises, things like that. Like physical abuse is really obvious to process. Sexual abuse is sort of similar. Or like, if people invade your personal space, you get wary, things like that. With like understanding the triggers of emotional abuse and physical abuse, with understanding the triggers of physical abuse and sexual abuse, it's really obvious because they're like physical movements. Whereas understanding the triggers of emotional abuse is much more subtle. And something that I've noticed is that I have what's called toxic shame. And the reason why I'm talking about this is that, growing up, my parents were like grade A perfectionists. And quite frankly, I don't think they were in the capacity to have children when they had children. Because they didn't have the time or energy to have children. Children have normal basic children needs. Children can't do the same things as adults. But as a child, I was expected to take care of my mom's emotional needs. I was expected to be my mom's therapist. I was expected to be empathetic. I was supposed to be able to, go to the counter and order what I needed. And this was like a very young child. This isn't an adult. This is a very, very young child. And I remember spilling orange juice one day at the kitchen counter. And this was my dad. And my dad basically beat me up with a broom. This was a young child. If this was adult spilling like 5 or 6 cups, you'd be like, what's wrong with you? But this was like a young child spilling 1 cup of orange juice getting beaten up by her parents. And I remember as a kid, if I ever did anything that wasn't A+, it would always be, we're going to disown you. We're going to kick you out of the family. We're going to beat you up. And as an adult, what I realize that's turned me into is this sort of perfectionist. In terms of like, if I don't do everything perfectly, or if everything's not always perfect, I'm always worried. And it turned into this sort of toxic shame where I always feel this guilty. I always feel guilty for no reason. And I realize I always feel guilty for no reason precisely because if I wasn't always perfect 24/7, my parents would project this sort of shame onto me for no reason. Okay, so I switched channels just now. Oh, actually I can't do that. I realized I can't flip it because it's already started recording. So, yeah. But, and then, what else? So I realized I have toxic shame. And I was doing some research into this. And basically there's like guilt, which is like, oh, like, you know, you spilled a cup of oranges. Oh, I feel guilty for that. But then there's shame, where it's like you have this sort of negative emotion attached to something way out of proportion for what it is. Like, you know, I was bullied a lot. In elementary school, I was bullied, and then high school, I was bullied. Middle school and college, I weren't bullied. And, you know, I would have people call me names. And even my mom would call me a name. And it was really bad because, you know, I would wear hand-me-down clothes for my sister. Because my sister was older than me, and my parents didn't want to buy new clothes because, like, you're going to grow out of it anyway. You're still growing, so just wear your sister's old clothes. And I remember I got an award for being in honor society, and I got an award for being in like the top 10% of my class in high school. And that's a pretty big deal because there was like hundreds of students. And I remember going to the award ceremony, and typically your parents will be like, "Yay, you know, good job. Let's go to dinner, or let's celebrate, or, you know, here's a gift. Like, good job for being a great student." But instead of saying, "Hey, good job for being a great student," what I got called was a whore at my award ceremony. And it was like very conflicting messages because my sister was never called a whore for wearing the same dress when she owned it. But more than that, the conflicting messages were, you have to be perfect all the time or I'm going to disown you. But when you do better than I think you should, I'm going to penalize you too. And it was this really weird dynamic in my family where I needed to do very, very well. But if I did too well, my mom would seem to put down my achievements. You know, in college, I didn't pay for any tuition. My entire tuition was covered. You know, typically things like this your parents would applaud you for, whereas my parents diminished all of my achievements and everything I did well. And in my family, it was this sort of weird thing where you had to do really, really well, but the standards were completely arbitrary because every time I did well, I was put down and I was belittled and I was bullied by my own family. And this sort of created this internal sort of toxic shame where I always feel guilty and I always feel like I'm wrong for no reason. And I realize I always feel guilty and I always feel wrong because I was never perfect in my parents' eyes. You know, they wanted good grades, but when I got good grades, they'd call me a whore for completely random reasons instead of applauding me. And what I realized a long time ago was that I was raised by narcissistic parents. In terms of, they wanted me to do well, but not well enough that I outshone them. And it was weird because I always felt like my mom was jealous of me and sort of in a competition with me. And it pissed me off because I saw the way they treated my sister, and the way they treated my sister was completely differently. My sister is what I found out was the golden child, and I was what I found out to be the scapegoat. You know, when my parents foreclosed, or when they filed for bankruptcy and one of their houses was foreclosed on, or they sold it, I don't remember what happened, they basically blamed me for it. And they're like, you know, we bought this house for you, and now, and I heard the thing was, I was just a kid. You know, we moved around a lot as a kid. They didn't buy the house for me, they just bought the house. And I remember they were like, you know, this is your fault. This is your fault. And any time anything negative happened to my family, it was always my fault. And the reason why I hate this so much is that, you know, with physical abuse or with sexual abuse, the triggers are obvious, and sort of dealing with that fallout is really obvious. Whereas dealing with the fallout of something like emotional abuse or psychological abuse, it's much harder to follow the path or to trace the path of how to undo the damage it's wreaked on you. And I think for me, it's really hard because how do I explain this to someone without going through a long-winded story? And they're like, oh, well, maybe you're misguided, or maybe you're... No, this was actually what happened. And my family's pretty fucked up. And I hate it. Because I hate the emotional abuse so much because it's so much harder to unravel. And what I realize that in a lot of instances in my life, I failed to meet my potential, and I failed to meet my potential precisely because I knew as a child, whenever I did really, really well in something, my mom would get mad and she would call me a whore for my outfits, even though my outfits were often my sister's hand-me-downs. And it had nothing to do with my outfits, it had to do with the fact that she was jealous of me because I was getting attention for doing well at something. And then I realized later on in life that I would try to blend in and hide and not show off the things that I was good at, precisely because I didn't want to get bullied again by someone like my mother, because I internalized doing well with getting bullied. I internalized being good at something with being bullied. And because I internalized it, it was this sort of thing where anytime I was good at something, I would try to hide it. Or anytime I was good at something, I would try to downplay it. Or anytime I was good at something, I would try to make it not so obvious. And I would do this now, I realize, purposefully, because anytime I was good at something, my mom would basically diminish it completely. Whether it was just really bad. But the point of this video is, one, to just let it all out, but two, going back to the sort of stream versus pond analogy. Before talking about this out loud, it felt more like a pond festering in my head, but now that I'm talking about it, now it feels more like a stream. Because it feels more like a stream now versus a pond, it just feels better. It just feels a lot better. And I guess I'm wondering, what is something in your life that you feel that you haven't openly talked about, that you think may be your sort of pond? What kind of thoughts are your pond that you wish was a stream? And how do you think it would affect your success in life if you let it out and vented it? Cool.